All right, so this is a new workshop for us. We have not done this presentation before. And it kind of got started because I was getting lots of questions over the years about things that relate to botany and plant science. And it's just things that we wouldn't normally cover in some of our regular workshops. So we're going to talk about lots of things you learned about in science class. I often get people ask me if I studied botany at college, and I did, but that wasn't my major, because botany is really a little bit different than horticulture, obviously. Sometimes it's called plant biology. Lately, at the university level, they've been starting to call it plant science more, but basically it's the science of plant life. But it is, it is a branch of biology. So if you took biology, you learned a lot of this stuff anyhow. And definitely, yeah, right now at the university level, they're definitely using the term plant science. That's what they're calling the textbooks lately. And the current classes that I see are actually focusing a little more on just important plants that we grow, as humans, as opposed to just plants that are general in the wild type plants. So anyhow, that's the difference. That's what's going on. Some other definitions. We got a lot of definitions here at the beginning just to give you a little background. And so then you hear about agriculture. And agriculture, usually think of like giant, big farming type stuff like you see in that picture there. But actually, when you're gardening in your backyard, you're participating in agriculture. So here's our definitions: just the science and practice of cultivating the soil, producing crops, or raising livestock. And also has to do with the preparation and marketing of all those products too. So for agriculture, which is a big subject, we break it down into some other fields, which some of you may have heard of. So agronomy over there on the left is field crops, so things like grains, like wheat and oats and rice, but also legumes, field crops like soybeans, etc. And then also oilseed crops. So that's agronomy. And then also forages. So think of like things like alfalfa that's grown for hay for animals. And that's agronomy. So forestry, obviously, is the cultivation of trees in forests as opposed to like trees in your backyards. Sometimes you'll hear the term silviculture. And sometimes forestry is for growing trees for lumber, other times it's for growing trees for other products, or sometimes it's just for enjoying the forest, like in our national forest. And then horticulture, we'll talk about a little more in detail, but I think of like vegetables, fruits, and flowers. And then another field in agriculture is animal husbandry, which is raising livestock, often for food. So think of like chickens, for meat or eggs, or cows. We raise them for milk or meat. So lots of different forms of animal husbandry. And then there's food science, which has to do with all the scientific parts of developing and using food, like, preserving, making food products, getting chemicals from food to use in other things. So very complex topic there. And just a little bit of definitions before we get into horticulture more. So gardening, is just the activity of growing herbs and flowers, ornamental plants, vegetables, and fruits. Horticulture is a little more to do with the science and the practice. So if you're studying about growing herbs, flowers, ornamentals, plants, vegetables, and fruits, and learning how to do that and studying different methods and things like that, then you're studying horticulture. And so most gardeners I know are actually, even though they don't know it, are studying horticulture. And most gardeners I know, even though they may not know it, they're actually horticulturists because they're studying and practicing and learning things as they go, as opposed to just carrying out instructions. So you may not have known this, that you're now a horticulturist. So, all right, horticulture breaks down into several different fields also. So floriculture over there on the left. So that's flowers, but So that could be garden flowers, like when you go buy things at the greenhouse, but also um, would be like foliage plants. If you buy, potted flowering plants like poinsettias or mums. So all different kinds of things like that. Cut flowers, lots of parts to floriculture. And then there's pomology, which is fruit production. So think of like, tree fruits, berry fruits, also like grapes. There's actually sort of a sub program or category of pomology that's just called viticulture, which has to do with wine, growing grapes for wine typically. And then there's vegetables, which the term for that is olericulture, which is something you'll probably almost never hear, but that's what they call it. So growing vegetables. Then arboriculture or arboriculture, trees and shrubs. So like these would be like trees and shrubs, not for forests, but for landscaping and growing in your backyard. And also the maintenance and care of those trees and shrubs. And then there's landscape design, which is taking all these plants and putting into landscapes and making nice places for us to be. And then there's turf management, which is like lawn grasses and how to grow those things. Lots of times people in college were studying turf management because they wanted to work on golf courses and things like that, or the turf management company or whatever. I have never been super interested in turf management. I'll just tell you that right out, just because it's just grass. Vegetables, trees and shrubs, flowers, fruits, all were a lot more interesting to me when I was in college. All right, let's talk about plant taxonomy, the classification of plants. That's what plant taxonomy is. There's scientists and there's societies that, actually kind of monitor the names of plants and give them their official names. And plants are classified in groups. You probably learned about this in biology class, just like all animals are classified in different groups and subgroups. And for plants, it's actually based on the characteristics of the reproductive parts of the plant. So think like the flowers, the seeds, the fruits. And so in this inverted pyramid that you see here at the top, you see kingdom. So we're going to be talking about the plant kingdom. And then that's broken down into different divisions, of which we'll talk about at least a couple of those that are important. And then there's classes and orders. Don't worry about those too much, but families are important. We'll talk about, vegetable and fruit families. And then genus and species, which actually give the plants their specific name. So a little more detail here. It used to be pretty simple. When I was going to college, we only had two kingdoms. We had the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. And then they've changed that. So they took certain things, some of the more primitive organisms, and put them in their own kingdoms. So things like algae are not part of the plant kingdom anymore. But so it's kind of important to know what actually defines a member of the plant kingdom. So here are the characteristics. They're multicellular, meaning they're not just single cell organisms. They also have a defined cell wall. Some of those other organisms, their cell walls are not clearly defined. Plants also are not motile. They don't move on their own. I mean, they blow in the wind, but they don't walk around like animals do. So that's a little bit different from the animal kingdom. And this last one is probably the biggest difference from other organisms, is that they make their own food through photosynthesis. And we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail here. But here's kind of an outline of the plant kingdom. The big breakdown is between non-flowering and flowering plants. Over on the left, you see some different things. You see spore-bearing plants. So think of like ferns and mosses and some other primitive plants. And on the right side of the non-flowering plants, you see naked seeds, which meaning they're not enclosed in a fruit. So that's a little bit different. And so think of things like evergreen trees like pines and spruces and stuff. There's also some other primitive, more primitive than flowering plants, things that you don't see very often, like cycads, and of course there's the ginkgos, which are in a category all by themselves. But most of the plants are actually going to be in the category on the right, the flowering plants. So if you're a gardener, you know, other than a few evergreens, maybe some ferns, most everything is going to be in that category of flowering plants. And that breaks down into a couple of categories. There are monocots and dicots, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But the flowering plants, the other name for them is angiosperm. But pretty much all the plants that people grow in their gardens, other than, like I say, you know, ferns and some evergreens and some other things, are going to be classified as angiosperms. They are flowering plants. And so it literally means, the term literally means a plant that produces seeds within an enclosure. In other words, it's a plant that has fruits. And so you see here on the right a picture, there's a flower for a pumpkin. And then right to that, you see the pumpkin fruit, which has seeds inside of it. Also right below that, you'll see a tomato. You see the little tomato flower and little cherry tomatoes there. And inside those cherry tomatoes are seeds, or will be seeds as it develops. And these are both examples of angiosperms, flowering plants. And so they're unique from other groups of plants, those ones we talked about earlier, the non-flowering plants, because they produce plants that have flowers, and the flowers develop fruits that contain seeds, and the seeds contain endosperm, which is a starchy material that provides nutrition for the embryo. So a little bit of background there. And lots of times people get confused when I say that almost all the plants you see everywhere are flowering plants, because lots of times you don't see the flowers. And that's because sometimes they're not very showy, they're not brightly colored. I mean, many flowers, when you go to a greenhouse in the springtime, you see all these different flowering plants there. They're usually brightly colored, they're showy, they're large, they're easily visible, and we call those conspicuous flowers. And so, you know, most of the plants that are grown for ornament, you know, would be considered conspicuous flowers. Inconspicuous flowers are flowers that either they're small, they're definitely not showy, they're not brightly colored, sometimes they're difficult to see. So right below there's flowers on the top, which are hibiscus flowers, very bright and pretty. Right below that, you will see some oak tree flowers. And a lot of people will say, I didn't know oak trees flowered, but they do, just like pretty much almost all the trees do flower, except for those evergreens I was talking about and the ginkgo. Like elm trees, maples, all kinds of trees flower. And some of them are showy. In fact, some of the fruit plants we'll see, like apple trees, they have pretty flowers. Peaches have beautiful flowers, but a lot of trees don't have flowers that you even would recognize. And so you'll look at it and it just looks green. And so you think it's just budding out or something like that, but you don't actually realize that it's having flowers. So, but even like grasses, like lawn grasses, they flower, but usually don't think of them as flowers because they're not brightly colored and they're not highly visible. So, all right, back to the monocots and the dicots, because the group of flowering plants divides into two categories, monocots and dicots. And if you've ever seen seedling sprouts, sometimes you notice the first little leaves that come up are a little bit different, and they don't look exactly like the rest of the plant. Like when you see the first leaves on a tomato, they don't look like the regular tomato leaves that you see later on. And that's true for all the little things. So they call those seed leaves, and the actual scientific name for them is cotyledon. And some seedlings will have one cotyledon, like the little picture on the right here that looks like a little blade of grass. The one on the left has two cotyledons, two seed leaves. And so that would be a dicot. The other one is monocot. The other thing that kind of defines monocots is that they have parallel veins in the leaf. You know, like if you've ever looked at leaf and you can kind of see the veins in it. So like if you look at this corn plant here on the left, It's got parallel veins, parallel running like, a railroad track or whatever. And if you look at grasses, they're the same thing. Other things like tulips and onions, they also have parallel veins because they are all monocots. And so when their little seeds sprout up, they're just going to have one little leaf come up at first, as opposed to two. But all of the other plants have two cotyledons. And so whenever you see them sprout, you'll see the first two little seed leaves coming up. And then after that, you'll see the regular leaves coming along. So dicots are different. Besides having two cotyledons, they have veins that are fan-like. So if you look at this squash leaf here, it's got really pronounced veins that you can see kind of branches out like a fan, or branches out like the branches on a tree, as opposed to being parallel. So that would show you that that is a dicot plant. So, all right, now we're going to talk about plant names, because names are important, just like names are important to people. It's important to know the names of plants. And so typically, most often, what we use are common names. And that's just when people are talking about plants in everyday language, they're using common names. But there are some problems with using common names because they're not exact. Like in different locations, either different countries, sometimes they use different common names for the same plant. Sometimes even, even in one part of our country to another part of the country, it'll be the same plant, but they'll call it by a different common name depending on where you're at. And sometimes the names will change over time because the name becomes more popular. So it's whatever's popular. It's almost like, think of it like a nickname. The other thing is that sometimes, multiple plants, there might be a bunch of different plants that are totally different, but they'll have the same common name because they have some common characteristics. And as I mentioned before, a single plant might have multiple common names. But scientific names are the ones that often you'll see, like if you buy a plant at the nursery, it'll list a common name first, and underneath that, it'll list a complicated looking name that looks hard to read. And so those are the scientific names, and they're based on the language of Latin. So they have Latin origins. But the important thing is they are recognized worldwide. If you look at a plant like an eggplant and you're looking at the scientific name of it, Solanum melangonum, it's going to be the same wherever you are in the whole world. It's not going to be different. And so you'll know specifically what you're talking about. It's a specific name for a specific plant. So it's almost like it's, I don't know, it's almost like it's your specific DNA or something like that. Anyhow, but each plant has a genus name and a species name. And the name should be italicized in print, so you'll know that what you're looking at is a scientific name. And the genus name should be capitalized, and the species name will not be capitalized. So we'll look at that, see what that looks like here. All right, so let's talk about eggplant. Common names, sure, we just call it eggplant. In Australia, that's what they call them. In New Zealand. But if you go to Europe, especially France, they use a French word, aubergine. And you'll hear someone talking about that and say, what the heck are they talking about? And you look at the pictures, oh, they're talking about eggplants. If you're in Southeast Asia, India, South Africa, brinjal is a name they use there. It's actually Indian. But then there is other names that show up in different places around the world, like the melongene, the garden egg, the guinea squash. Don't know where that came from. But these are all common names for the same thing as eggplant. So the scientific name is Solanum melonginum. And there's, what you see in the grocery store typically as an eggplant. But lots of times there's different varieties. You know this if you're a gardener, because when you buy your tomatoes, there's a million different varieties. And so within a species, like the species of eggplant or tomato, there's many, many varieties. And what we call a variety that's cultivated as opposed to just a variety that shows up in nature, we call it a cultivar, which is short for a cultivated variety. But usually when people are talking about varieties that are cultivars, they just use the term variety. So for some plants like tomato, there's many, many different kinds of tomatoes. So there's many different cultivars or varieties. So back to our eggplant. So our common name, here's a specific eggplant. This is a variety, a cultivar. It's called ping tang. It's one that we grow here at the community garden. It's an Asian eggplant. It's very pretty. It's purple. It's long and skinny. So it looks different than the eggplant we saw a little bit ago. So the scientific name is going to be the same, Solanum melongena, but the variety is tagged down at the end and it's put in single quotes, ping tang, and that lets you know that that's part of this plant's official name. So you have the genus name first. There's other species that aren't eggplants in this genus, and then the specific genus species for eggplant is the melongena, and then this specific variety is the ping tang. So, you know, you don't have to learn the scientific names for all the plants. I think it's kind of interesting. It's also just useful. So sometimes if you're looking up a plant and you want to know which plant it really is, you might actually have to look up the scientific name just to make sure it's the plant that you think it is. So. All right, we're going to go back to plant families again. We talked about at the top of this pyramid, the plant kingdom, and then the division that we're talking about are the flowering plants. And then I said we're not worrying too much about class and order, but down below that are families. There's over 400 plant families in the flowering plants, the angiosperms. And it's kind of just helpful to be familiar with the major plant families. Oops, I just say I made a mistake there. I'll have to correct that. I've repeated plant families. Because some family members share characteristics of how they grow, but also sometimes they share like common pests, like insects will attack lots of members of the same plant family. Sometimes diseases will affect, you know, the same various members of a plant family. And so it's useful to know the plant families, especially when you're planting your garden, because we recommend that people do crop rotation. And so if you take all the members of the tomato family and put them in one part of your garden, then the next year you can move all those plants to another part of your garden and then put something else in its place. So you're not planting all the plants from the same family in the same place every year, because it's a good idea to rotate your crops. So we actually have a handout here at the community gardens. I think it's available on our website. It shows vegetable plant families. It talks like at the top, the bean and pea family, the cabbage and mustard family, the carrot family, the onion family, tomatoes and peppers, etc., squash and cucumbers. And then there's some miscellaneous families that don't have as many members in them. But it's just a really useful tool to learn the plant families and become familiar with that. And that will help you with your crop rotation. And just to know just the connection between different species. All right, we're going to talk about stages of plant growth. There's kind of three main stages: seed stage, the vegetative stage, and the reproductive stage. This is kind of stuff you probably learned about in science class in 8th grade. In the seed stage, you have just the seed, and it's dormant. It starts out dormant. It doesn't necessarily grow right away. Sometimes it's complicated to break that dormancy, like it won't actually sprout until maybe it has a cold period or something else has to happen to it. A certain amount of time might need to pass. Other seeds just sprout right away. They don't really have dormancy. But so seed may be dormant for a while, and then it goes through the phase of germination where it's actually sprouting, the seed is breaking open, and then it's emerging from the ground. So that's all part of the seed stage. And then there's the vegetative stage. So think of like that's the plant is growing. So it's sprouted already, and now it's starting to grow. The stem is starting to get longer. It's elongating. Sometimes they call that the shoot. but then it's also putting out leaves, and then it's growing more leaves, and the stem, maybe it's branching off, but no flowers are happening yet. So this is the vegetative stage. It's just green growth. And this is where the photosynthesis is happening, because the leaves are there, they're catching rays of sunshine, and they're making food for the plant. We'll talk more about that, how that works in a little bit. But then at some point, the plant is going to reproduce, because that's actually the goal of plants, is to reproduce. Plants are very goal-oriented, and so that's, plants don't think like we do, but if they did, they would be thinking, I need to reproduce, I need to reproduce. The reproductive stage has to do with flowers and fruit. The first thing that happens is it will initiate flower buds, and at first they're very tiny, and you may not be sure that they're even happening, but you look really close and you'll see little tiny flower buds start happening. And then depending on the size of the flower, they'll get bigger and fuller, and at some point those flower buds will open up and flowers will come out. And then pollination will happen at some point, hopefully. And then once the flowers are pollinated, the fruit will start to develop and ripen. And then inside those fruits, there'll be seeds, and the seeds will be developing and maturing. And then at some point, that fruit will break open, either because it just rots, or sometimes it's like a bird comes along and eats a berry and swallows it, and the seeds are inside, and then it passes through the bird system, and they'll get dispersed. So there's lots of different methods of seed dispersal. Sometimes it's as simple as just the seed falls to the ground because the fruit is ripe. Other times it's because animals get involved and carry it. Sometimes seeds have sticky things on them, like little burrs, and they'll stick to animals or people, and they'll get carried distances, and the seeds will get moved around. Sometimes there's certain seeds that fly, like you've seen little dandelion seeds that poof out and the wind carries them. So there's lots of different methods of seed dispersal. So those are the 3 stages. And it's just useful to know that lots of times when you're in the fruiting stage, you don't want to add like a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, because you're trying to encourage the fruiting, the flowering, and fruiting, as opposed to just the vegetative growth. Okay, so another term you'll see in plant science books is morphology, or plant morphology. Has to do with the physical form and the external structure of the plants, the parts of the plant. So like in this diagram here, parts of the plant, you probably saw stuff like this in school. So all the different parts are listed over here on the left, and I think most of them are actually in this diagram. So of course you're familiar with the roots, that's what's going on underground, and then the stem comes up, and the roots, the purpose is to absorb water, but also minerals, and take them in, to help provide the nutrients that the plant will need to help make food. Stems actually support the plants, and sometimes stems stand up on their own. Other times they need some support, like a tomato plant will just kind of flop over. So we like to either stake them up or put them in a cage to hold them up. Some vines need something to climb on. They just don't climb up on their own. They don't stand up on their own. They need something to climb on. But other plants stand up on their own, like trees, and many of our vegetables just stand up on their own. And so their stems are self-supporting. And then leaves. So you see the little leaves all over the plant, and they're performing photosynthesis, making food for the plant and making food for us. And then at some point, there will be flowers that will be happening. And flowers are, this little diagram says it helps in reproduction. I wouldn't say that. I would say flowers are the reproduction. It's the beginning of the reproduction. If there's no flowers, there's going to be no fruit, there's going to be no seeds, there'll be no reproduction. So flowers, are coming along here. They'll get pollinated, and then fruit will be happening. So here's our fruit, and the fruit is basically protecting the seeds. And then inside the fruit, you can't see them, but there'll be seeds inside there. So it's kind of breaking the top half into the shoot system, and the bottom half, which is underground, is the root system. So those are the basic parts of the plant. Some plants have other parts that are more complicated, or sometimes they don't look like this. They're different. Maybe they're stems. There's even plants that have some stems that are underground. So there's sometimes the roots are shaped different because they store fruit in them. And of course, there's many, many different kinds of flowers and leaves and fruits. All right, let's talk about plant classification by life cycle. So a plant goes through its life cycle, seed sprouts, the plant grows up, eventually it flowers and it fruits, and then when it's done fruiting, the life cycle of the plant is over. So some plants do that all in 1 year, in 1 calendar year, and we call those annuals. So everything happens, you plant the seed, it grows up, it has leaves, eventually it may or may not flower. Depends if it's something like lettuce, you're hopefully going to be eating it before it flowers. But if you just let it go, it would flower, and it would do that all in 1 calendar year. So just some examples of some annual garden crops, vegetable crops would be lettuce, mustard greens, arugula, that's just a few of them. Biennials, on the other hand, are plants that complete their life cycle over a 2-year period. And generally, there'll be a cold period in the middle as it goes over the winter. So things like beets and carrots, Swiss chard, collards, kale, and onion. So we actually grow them as an annual in the sense that we grow them just for 1 year, typically. If you've ever had kale go over the winter, in its 2nd year, it'll actually start to flower and produce little tiny seed pods, which are technically the fruit of the kale. And inside those seed pods will be seeds. And same thing with onions. Sometimes onions will sprout even in the 1st year, but more typically onions would sprout in the 2nd year. Beets and carrots, Swiss chard, collards, if you ever carry them overwinter them, cover them up and protect them, in their 2nd year, they'll actually have their flowering and their little seeds and everything. So that just shows you how they are biennial. It takes a 2-year period to go through the entire life cycle. And then there's perennials. So those are plants that their life cycle is more than 2 years. They sometimes will flower in the 1st year, but they'll keep living for years after that and flower the next year and the year after that. Some perennials are very long-lived. Some may just live for 3 or 4 years. Some perennials don't flower in the 1st year. It doesn't happen until they've had a cold period. So they're just different. And of course, some things we're not even concerned about their flowering, like asparagus. We're just trying to grow it for the green stalks. We're not really trying to get flowers and fruits from asparagus. But these are some perennial food crops. So think of asparagus, comes up every year, lasts for a long time. Strawberries, they live for multiple years. Apples can live for many years. Rhubarb is another perennial vegetable. So these are all things that live for more than 2 years. And then there's some vegetables, some plants that are actually perennials, meaning in their native climate, where it's warmer, they would live for more than 2 years, like a tomato plant or a pepper. In the tropics, you can have them live for quite a number of years. Sweet potatoes. Here, where we're at, because we have cold winter, your tomatoes get killed by the frost. Your peppers get killed by the frost. Same thing for the sweet potatoes. But they are actually perennials because they would live a longer time. But we treat them as annuals because we're just growing them. Excuse me. We're just growing them for 1 year. So. All right. This is where we get to really exciting stuff. It's funny, when I was in school, I thought this was pretty boring, in 6th grade, 8th grade, You know, you get to high school, you study photosynthesis again. At each grade level, when you study it again, it gets a little more complicated. In college, it got even more complicated. And in college, they even had a graduate level course that was just photosynthesis, where for one entire semester, you study for 5 hours a week, plus your lab time, just on photosynthesis. And that's for someone who's going to be a serious plant scientist, obviously. But studying all the different chemical processes and all the things that are involved at the cellular level with, plants making food. So I don't completely understand photosynthesis. I don't think anybody does. It's just pretty amazing and miraculous, because what it is, if you'll remember from school, from 8th grade or whatever, it's the process by which plants use sunlight and water and carbon dioxide to create energy. And the energy they create is in the form of sugars and starches or carbohydrates. And then in the process, besides creating this energy, oxygen is generated. So that's, I remember hearing that. And that's obviously a big deal because oxygen is important, right? So in this little diagram, which if you Google photosynthesis diagrams, you'll see like 1,000 different diagrams, and some of them are more helpful than others. This one I thought was pretty good because it shows the sunlight shining down, and it's shining down on a little green plant, and the plant's taking in the sunshine, but also over here on the left, you'll see it's taking in carbon dioxide, because plant leaves have little openings on the bottom called stomata that open and close and allow the plant to take in gases. So it can take in carbon dioxide. And so it takes in the carbon dioxide. And then the other thing that's happening is the plant is taking up water, and it's also taking up minerals, which it needs for good plant growth. But to actually photosynthesize, it just needs the water, the carbon dioxide, and the sunlight. And then through the process of the photosynthesis, it turns that into sugars and starches, the carbohydrates we're talking about, and it will store those. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But then in the process, also it's releasing oxygen out into the air. And so there you have the miraculous, amazing process of photosynthesis that makes food, but also generates oxygen. So some interesting facts about photosynthesis, plants making food. So plants are creating food energy to store for use when the plant needs it. So it's storing food for when it will need it, and then it uses it as it grows. And so as it's growing more stems, more leaves, it's using some of that food that it just created from photosynthesis, so that it can produce more leaves and more stems, so it can produce more energy, and the plant will get bigger and bigger. That's how plants can get large and have many branches, and trees get tall and all that stuff. But it's also using its food energy to produce flowers that will develop fruit, that will produce seeds, that will grow future plants. So obviously the plants making food is for the benefit of that plant, but it's also for the benefit of other organisms like humans and animals. So plants are actually creating food for us and for animals. And the plant doesn't do that just because it's trying to be nice. It's just the way the plant was designed. So the interesting thing is that humans and animals, humans and other animals, because we are animals, cannot make their own food energy. I mean, you can cook, you can make your own meals, but you cannot make your own food energy. Only plants can do that. So we're dependent on the food energy created by plants, and they make that food energy through photosynthesis. We are totally, totally dependent on that. So through photosynthesis, plants supply most of the food energy to sustain life on Earth. So And I say most, I mean 99.99999%, you know, so. And photosynthesis is also pretty much responsible for producing and maintaining the oxygen content of the Earth's atmosphere, which is at a certain percentage. So obviously, if we wouldn't have that, we wouldn't have enough oxygen to breathe. If plants didn't make food that can be stored inside the plant, we wouldn't have any food to eat. And so people say, well, what about animals when you're eating meat? Well, if you're eating animals like beef or pork, they got their food from eating plants. So basically, you're still eating plant food. It's just indirectly it's going through the animal process. So really, all the food in the world comes from plants initially. All right, let's talk about plant responses to light, because that's part of that photosynthesis. And you probably noticed this if you've ever grown houseplants on your window, or if you tried to start tomato seedlings in your windowsill, is that plants grow towards the light. So there is a characteristic of plants, it's the response they make to light, is they grow towards the source of the light. And that's called phototropism. So like in this photograph on the right here, you'll see these tomato seedlings, and they're all leaning towards the light. And so the thing you'd want to do is like turn around the other way. You do that with houseplants too, so they aren't all just leaning one way. But also, if you've ever grown a plant in a pot and the pot gets tipped over, instead of just growing sideways, it starts to grow sideways, but as soon as it starts growing a little more, it starts growing upright again. So here in this little diagram, you see the plant on the left is growing up towards the light. This plant in the pot, this looks like a bean plant, I think, got tipped over and started to grow sideways, but then it starts to grow straight up towards the light. So that's phototropism, and that's just how plants respond to light. But there's also a plant response to gravity, and we call that geotropism. Some of the more modern textbooks are now calling it gravitropism, but basically it's the same thing. So this is the response of plant roots to the force of the Earth's gravity. And basically what that means is roots go down towards the center of the Earth, towards the center of the Earth's gravity, which is good that it does that, because if they didn't, roots would just be growing out on top of the ground and they wouldn't survive and it wouldn't be good. But also the roots go down into the soil and they help anchor the plant so the plant will stand up and not fall over. You think about like trees that are 100 feet tall, that takes a lot of roots to anchor that. They have to be firmly anchored in the soil. So here you see the little diagram of the roots going down, and yeah, they'll branch off, but then they go down. And sometimes, they go sideways a little bit, but still the roots are going down towards the center of gravity. And just like we saw in that phototropism diagram, the little bean plants here with the plant getting tipped over. So not only does that mean this starts going up, but the roots inside that pot will start changing the orientation and going down. They'll be going down because they're being affected by gravity. One of the interesting things I read as I was preparing for this is that this scientist said, we've been studying this concept of geotropism, plants, roots going downwards, responding to gravity, for over 100 years, but we still don't really understand why it happens. So it's one of the mysteries of life that is just kind of miraculous, the way that plants grow. So it's just very amazing to me. All right, plant response to temperatures. You all are pretty much aware that plants need certain temperatures to grow. Some plants can go over the winter, some plants can't. Every plant has its own growth range. Every plant has an ideal growth range. Like you might be able to survive, but the plant doesn't really grow that much. For instance, if you're overwintering kale, it might go over the winter. Here's some kale plants on the top, but they're not really growing very much because they're not in the ideal temperature range, but they're surviving. And so every plant will also have a minimum temperature tolerance. At some point, if the temperatures drop low enough, cold enough, a plant will die. It won't be able to survive. And so when you hear about plant hardiness zones, what that is telling you that the coldest that a plant can probably survive. So like zone 5, depending on which map you're using, that means like the average coldest winter temperature will be -10 degrees. So if a plant can't tolerate that, it would not be a good plant for that area. Now, most of the things that we grow in our vegetable garden are not winter hardy, so they don't make it over the winter. Just a few like kale and spinach can go over the winter. But tomato plants, yeah, they're not winter hardy here, and they will get killed when frost comes. 32 will finish them off. Other things can go a little bit cooler, like lettuce can go cooler, peas, spinach, all the cool season vegetables. And of course, extreme high temperatures also are not good for plants. The hotter it gets, at some point, plant growth slows down. At some point, plants will die if it gets too hot. So extreme temperatures will slow down the growth, either hot or cold. It's also important, it's not something you think about, but if you're growing stuff inside your house, like trying to start seedlings, plants actually like what we call diurnal temperatures, meaning temperatures change from day to night. In the daytime, it's warmer. So like out in nature, it's warmer. At nighttime, it gets cooler. Plants actually like it like that. That's part of their normal life cycle or whatever. So like in the greenhouse, we have a daytime temperature and a nighttime temperature. It's going to be different for the warm season vegetables and the cool season vegetables. And then the other thing is regarding temperatures is some plants actually need a cold temperature, a cold period to grow. So like if you were wanting to grow an apple tree, you might think, oh, I'm just going to grow it inside a pot and then I'll bring it inside for the winter. But that would not work well because that apple tree actually needs a cold period, a certain number of cold days below a certain temperature in order for that tree to continue to grow. The buds go dormant, but they don't break dormancy until they have that cold period. Plants don't, the fruit and fruit buds and everything, that all doesn't happen, doesn't open up until it's gone through the cold period. So some seeds won't germinate until they've had a cold period. So if it's a plant that would normally go through a cold winter, you can read about it and see if it probably actually needs a cold period in order to grow and to continue to grow. All right, we're going to go back to how plants store food. Remember, plants create food through photosynthesis. So they do some short-term storage just in the leaves, because there's, that some of the sugars and the starches are located in the leaves and they're accessible to the plants, the leaves and the stems. But longer-term storage, plants will actually store in underground fleshy structures, bulbs, tubers, rhizomes, etc. We'll talk about that here in a minute. And there you see some pictures of some different storage fleshy structures that plants store their food in. But then plants also store food, energy for future generations in the fruits and the seeds. So it's putting some of that energy into there. It will last a while. The fruit will sometimes provide food for the seeds as they germinate or whatever. And inside the seed, there's some food stored inside there. So that's pretty amazing that happens. But that's for future generations. So think about that. But these specialized plant food storage structures, lots of times we think of them just as one kind of thing. We call them root crops because we think they all kind of grow underground. So we call them root crops, but they actually aren't all roots Some of them are stems. So that depending on the definition, what type it is and whether or not they have buds in them, they may or may not be roots. So bulbs are actually modified stems, onions, and garlic, which, yeah, so inside this onion plant, it's actually a stem. There's a little root at the bottom, and there's a little stem just waiting to grow. So if it goes over the winter the next year, so it stores this food in this bulb over the winter, and grow the next year. Tubers, potatoes, like what we call Irish potatoes, are actually tubers, and lots of times people will call something a tuber when it's not, but the main tuber that we would be eating would be potatoes. And on the potato, it's also a modified stem because you'll see little buds. We call them eyes, and when you're planting out your seed potatoes, you're wanting those to start sprouting. When you're trying to save your potatoes and eat them, you don't want them sprouting. But if you're actually having potatoes that you're going to be planting, you want them to sprout out so you can tell where the little sprouts are, so you can cut it up into sections, and so each section will have at least one or two of those eyes. But those eyes are just little buds on a stem, and so the potato itself is actually a stem, and but the plant stores food inside that tuber. And then there's tuberous roots, which is slightly different. It actually is a true root, has some stem on the end, sweet potatoes. And then there's actually true roots. So think of things like radishes and carrots, beets, turnips, etc. Over here on the right, you see radish. That actually is a root. It's not a bulb. It's not a modified stem. It's part of the root of the plant, but it's just become enlarged and fleshy, and the plant stores food in there for a later time, the following year. And then there's some plants which you might think are looks like a bulb or a tuber or a root or something, but it's actually just an enlarged stem. That one example of that would be kohlrabi. This thing up here in the left-hand corner here of these pictures. Those are called modified stems, but called kohlrabi. But people typically call them bulbs. And then there's rhizomes, which are also an underground food storage structure. And we don't have as much of that in the garden. If you grow iris plants, you have rhizomes. But for food, the main ones would be ginger, and some people are now starting to grow turmeric as a garden crop. But they grow from rhizomes. So you can see a ginger rhizome down here on the right. So, all right, let's talk about vegetables or fruits, because I get this question a lot. People ask about, is tomato a vegetable or a fruit? What about peas? Are they vegetables or fruits? And, you know, usually with an apple or cherry or strawberry, it's pretty clear cut. People say, I know that it's a fruit. So here's my answer, and it might be a little bit different from what you've heard. And, you know, if you go start Googling, is tomato a fruit or a vegetable, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. And one of the things they like to talk about is that some law was passed back in the 1800s that declared tomatoes as a vegetable or a fruit. I can't remember, because it has something to do with how they taxed it, you know, on tariffs and things like that. But really what it comes down to, the real definition of vegetable is any part of the plant that you eat. So a lot of it will make sense to you. So like when you're eating the leaves of lettuce, you're eating a vegetable. When you're eating a stem like asparagus or celery, you're eating a vegetable. When you're eating a carrot or a turnip or a radish, you're eating a root, so that's a root vegetable. One that's probably not quite as obvious, if you're eating flowers, which we don't typically just eat flowers, but sometimes we eat flower buds, like in this picture up here. This is broccoli. These little things that you eat, those are flower buds. They just haven't opened up yet. Sometimes if you let your broccoli go too long, flowers will open up, be little tiny flowers, and they can be pretty, but the quality of the broccoli goes down when the flower lets it open up. So you're trying to eat it before they open. And cauliflower also is flower buds. And artichokes, they're also flower buds. So those are vegetables. But then, which might be a little more confusing, is because it's a part of the plant that we eat. Remember, we saw the slide a while ago about all the different parts of the plant. These are the same parts. So one of the parts is a fruit. After the flower gets pollinated, the fruit starts to develop. And sure, sometimes it'll be something sweet, like an apple or a strawberry, and we know those are fruits, but also it might be things that aren't sweet. It might be like a tomato, it might be like a zucchini squash, it might be a pumpkin, a cucumber, an eggplant, peppers. So these are all fruits, and they are have seeds inside them, so they are fruits, but they're also vegetables. So we eat leafy vegetables, we eat stem vegetables, we eat root vegetables, we eat flower vegetables, flower bud vegetables, and we eat fruit vegetables. So the answer is a tomato is a vegetable and it's a fruit, but it's a special kind of vegetable. So all fruits are actually vegetables, but not all vegetables are fruits because there's other kinds of vegetables. And last, there's seeds, because that's part of the plant that we eat. So when you're eating peas, inside these little pea pods, those are actually seeds that you're eating. So, but they are a vegetable. Now, if you're eating the pea pod, like you're eating a sugar snap pea or a snow pea, you're actually eating a fruit. It just happens to have seeds inside of it. So that's kind of interesting to think about. So that's the differences between fruits and vegetables. If anyone wants to argue with me about it, we can do that later. All right, let's talk about plant reproduction. Plants reproduce two main ways, sexual reproduction and what we call asexual or non-sexual reproduction. The sexual reproduction in plants just refers to plants flower, they grow fruits, so they have fruits with seeds inside of them, and you plant the seeds, and that is part of the sexual process of that flower developing. So here you can see a squash flower, and there's a bee, bumblebee doing some good pollinating, and then the fruit develops, so it turns into a butternut squash, and it's growing on a trellis here. And inside this butternut squash, seeds are developing. And then once those fruit is harvested, you know, sometimes you'll just clear those seeds out, throw them away. Other times somebody might actually save those seeds and plant them. And so that will grow a new plant. So this plant has been reproduced through the process of flowering and fruiting, and that's called sexual reproduction. Because it involves all the stuff about pollen and ovaries and all the stuff that you read about in botany class or science class. So, all right. But then there's also non-sexual plant reproduction, or called asexual. And there's lots of different ways to do that. But the ones that probably you might be aware of most likely would be cuttings. So sometimes you can take a cutting off of a plant and root it. You can do that on a fig tree. Also, we kind of make cuttings off of sweet potatoes. We put sweet potatoes in water, or we put them in some potting mix, and they start to sprout out, and we just break off the little sprouts, and they form little roots, and that's a rooted cutting. And you can plant that, and it will grow. And it had nothing to do with flowering or seeds or fruits. Another way we reproduce plants is through grafting. And so like fruit trees, we take off part of the fruit tree we want, and then we put it onto the kind of the root of a fruit tree that we want and bind them up together, and then it starts to grow if it's successful graft. And then that top of that fruit tree will be the kind of fruit tree we want. It'll be particular kind of apple or peach or whatever. So pretty much most of the fruit trees that we grow are grafted. And there's all different kinds of grafts. It's kind of a very intensive, skill that people learn how to do. But here in the strong, you can see that they made a slit in this one branch. That's called the rootstock, and they slit it just a certain way, and then they put the top piece from the kind of apple or whatever plant that they want, and they insert it, they shave it so it fits in there, then they'll wrap it up real tight. What they're trying to do is make sure that the certain layer of cells, the cambium, on both of those plants is matching up so that it will grow together. And then it will grow into the new kind of fruit tree. So that's grafting. People don't generally do that themselves. Usually you buy a fruit tree that's already grafted. But then another way that plants reproduce, some plants produce runners, like strawberries. If you plant strawberries, they'll throw out a little tiny plant that comes out from it. It's on this little stalk, and then it's out at the side. And a little baby plant, at first it doesn't have roots on it, but then it kind of plants itself in the soil, and then roots start coming out. Well, you can cut that plant off and move it, and then it's a brand new plant. And so you reproduce the plant. But all of this none of it's happened through the flowering or production of fruit and seeds. So this is non-sexual plant reproduction. All right, pollination. I get lots of questions about pollination, and some of it's fairly simple and straightforward, but there's some parts that can get confusing to people. So, people know that bees do pollinating and other insects too. So it's not just bees, but there's a whole bunch of little wasps, some moths and butterflies, little tiny creatures, some flies. But primarily we're thinking of bees, like honeybees and bumblebees, but there's also a lot of native bees that do pollinating, and it's all very important. So the crops in the vegetable garden that are pollinated by bees would be squashes, pumpkins, cucumbers, cantaloupe, watermelon, and okra. Those are pretty much the main ones that are bee pollinated. So if you don't have bees, they will not get pollinated. If there's not any honeybees that come by, or if there's not any native bees, or let's say you're trying to grow some squash under row cover and you're covering it up to protect it from squash bugs, there's no bees that are going to get in there. So you might have to do some hand pollinating. You can do that. You can read about it on the internet. There's ways to do that. But it is fun to watch bees doing the pollinating and just see how busy they get doing that. And they're carrying pollen, and in the process, they're getting nectar to take back to their beehives. So those are the vegetables that are pollinated by bees. But there's a whole bunch of vegetables that are not needing bees for pollinating. So tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, beans, peas, peanuts, carrots, all the things listed here. All the members of the cabbage family, arugula, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, etc., kale, radishes, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, beets, Swiss chard. So to grow these as vegetables to eat, none of these need to be pollinated by bees, because when you're eating cabbage, you're not trying to eat something that's been pollinated. You're just trying to eat the green leaves of that cabbage. Same thing with collards. Now, kale, for instance, if you do carry it over the winter and you were trying to save your own kale seeds, it would need pollination for that. So bees are important for many of these things, but that would be for seed companies or people trying to grow their own seeds, save their own seeds. Some of them are also just self-pollinating, and some of them are wind pollinating. So there are other methods of pollination. Some of it's insect primarily bees. Other are pollinated by the wind, like corn. And then some are just self-pollinated just because of the close proximity of the flower parts. And they move around a little bit with the wind. They touch each other and do the pollinating that way, things like tomatoes, etc. So at least you know that these things don't need bees for pollination. Now, fruit crops, we're talking like orchard fruit crops, a whole different ballgame. Pretty much you need bees for all of them. You're growing apples, pears, peaches, cherries, plums, blueberries, all these things, raspberries, strawberries, all these things, they all need bees to do pollinating. So obviously bees are very important for food. So for some of the vegetables and many of our fruits, bees and other pollinators are extremely important. And so that's why it's good to understand that and to do anything we can to encourage them to multiply and thrive so we have good pollination. And that's why sometimes in orchards, they'll actually import beehives in during the flowering period just so to make sure they get enough pollination happening so they produce lots of food. All right, so we have some questions we get about pollination. We're almost done here, just a little bit more. Now we'll answer these pollination questions that I get. So in the vegetable garden, people ask questions about cross-pollination. Different vegetable species cannot pollinate each other. They can't cross-pollinate with each other. So like peppers and tomatoes, they're not going to, there's no cross-pollination going to be happening. But different vegetable varieties can cross-pollinate, but it won't affect this year's crop. So let's say you have a couple of varieties of squashes and some cross-pollination happens. And so the squashes that are going to come from that are going to be whatever variety you planted. If you planted a black zucchini variety, you're going to get black zucchini. But the seeds from that zucchini, if you save those, because they were cross-pollinated with some other squash, could be totally different. They could be even a pumpkin, which is the same species. So you could have something totally different. So that's why you have to watch it if you're saving seeds. But to produce a harvest, no vegetables need cross-pollination. You don't need to have two different kinds of peppers just to get peppers. So we'll talk about fruits in a minute because some of that's different, obviously. But so it's not like you have to have male and female peppers or whatever, things like that. So, all right. In the orchard, it is different. So fruit species generally do not pollinate each other. It happens sometimes with close enough relatives. But in different fruit varieties can cross-pollinate, but it won't affect the genetics of this year's crop. For instance, if you had a red apple and a yellow apple, and so they're cross-pollinating, they're planted next to each other, that's great because you need that in order to get fruit. But it's not like you're going to get a mixture from that year's crop that would be like a mixture of red and yellow apples. But if you took the seeds from some of those apples and you planted them and grow them out, you might get some different apples that would be a mixture of those two different kinds of apples, but different flavors, different colors, etc., different disease resistance. So that's how that would work. But some fruits do need cross-pollination, meaning you have to have more than one variety in order to produce a harvest. So here we have a diagram. On the left, hopefully I've got all these right. Matt knows more about this than I do, but I think I basically got them. So apples, pears, Asian pears, the ones listed in that category on the left, you do need two different kinds of varieties. You need a pollinator variety. You can plant your main variety, but you need a second variety to provide the cross-pollination. There are some sweet cherries that are self-pollinating. There are some plums that are self-pollinating. But usually you'll get better pollination if you have two different varieties. So, and you know, for different plants, the distance between the plants will vary. Generally, if they're real close to each other, it won't be an issue at all. Bees do travel pretty far, so sometimes if you have, you know, another apple tree, you know, a few hundred feet away, it will still work. But generally, if you have two close to each other, you'll have much better pollination. So now some of the things do not need a pollinator variety. You can just grow one of them. For like a peach tree, you do not have to have two different peaches. We get this question all the time. People thinking they need two peaches, or sour cherries, or blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, all these things. You do not need to have two different varieties to get fruit. So that's the requirements on cross-pollination for fruit orchard crops. Just a few more random pollination questions. We're just about done. Because I get this lots of times. People think sometimes if you plant cantaloupe and cucumbers together, that they're going to cross and it's going to make your cantaloupe not taste good. So sometimes people have cantaloupes that aren't very sweet and they think, oh my gosh, I think they crossed with my cucumbers, because they are fairly closely related. You can notice the flowers look similar, but that would not happen. Not saying they couldn't cross. I don't know how close they are to each other, but they're not likely to cross. And so the other one I get lots of times about hot peppers and bell peppers. Like, people think, oh, don't plant your hot peppers too close to your bell peppers because they're going to cross pollinate, and it could make your bell peppers taste hot. And you could get some cross pollination, but it would not affect this year's pepper. It would affect only the seeds for next year's crop if you're saving your own seeds. So again, you don't have to worry about this. If you're planting, you can plant cucumbers right next to your cantaloupe. You can plant hot peppers right next to your bell peppers, and you don't need to worry about it. So, and then I get questions about separate male and female plants on vegetables. I've had people ask me about, you know, I've had people swear that there's male pepper plants and separate female pepper plants, and that's not how it works. They're separate male and female plants are pretty rare in the garden. The only ones I know of would be asparagus and spinach. And I guess there's some cucumber varieties that are female only. So, you know, it doesn't make any difference for us. If you plant a bunch of spinach seeds and some of the plants are male and some of them are female, because we're just trying to grow leaves. And same thing for asparagus, although they do say that the male asparagus plants maybe are a little bit more productive. But, you know, when we're growing asparagus, we're not trying to get the fruits or the seeds. We are just trying to get the stalk. So it doesn't really matter. So you don't need to worry about male and female plants in your vegetable garden. In your fruit garden, you don't have to worry about it very much at all, because all the fruits that we normally grow, the male and female plants, male and female flowers are on the same plant. Sometimes they're on the same flower. So a couple of exceptions would be kiwis, like hardy kiwis. If you're trying to grow those, you do have to have female plants, and you have to have at least one male plant to provide cross-pollination. Persimmons, most people aren't growing persimmons, but if you were, you need to have a male persimmon also. So, and I guess there's some mulberry varieties that are male and female, but typically, most people don't grow mulberries on purpose, so they don't have to worry about it. So, all right, that is the end of our workshop for today.